All right, well, if you got your Bibles, if you'd flip open to the book of Joel. That's where we are today, the book of Joel. Have you guys been enjoying this major lesson from Minor Prophets series? Really cool. I've really enjoyed studying this and kind of diving into it. And so before we get into the actual scripture, I just wanted to give you a quick, if you don't have a Bible, just kind of wave your hand. The ushers are carrying Bibles around and you can check those out. You just got to check them back in at the end of service. That's a joke. You don't have to do that. You can keep them. Anybody else need Bibles? Go ahead and flip it open to Joel. All right, so here's the backstory of the book of Joel. It was actually written, it's like Hebrew poetry. It's really beautifully written. And a lot of people think Joel was kind of the most eloquent of the minor prophets in terms of the way that he wrote. And if you read through all the minor prophets, you'll see a lot of the same verbiage used. And it's fairly commonly believed that Joel was kind of early on, so he was one of the first, if not the first. And in fact, there's this phrase that he coins in Joel that's called the day of the Lord. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You've heard that, the day of the Lord? So if you think of it in terms of like hit songs, he was the guy who came up with the day of the Lord. He had the first big hit with the day of the Lord. It's kind of like, you know, the Monkees song, I'm a Believer, and Smash Mouth did it in Shrek. You know what I'm talking about? Isn't that right? Yeah. She's like, that's right. So who knows the original writer of I'm a Believer? Neil Diamond. That's right. So Joel was like the Neil Diamond of the day of the Lord. Look, it's a song thing. Lighten up. So basically, Joel, the prophet Joel, is a guy who was sent by God to the Israelites, the nation of Judah, to really sound the alarm. This was a warning. And if you haven't read through this, basically there's this natural disaster that had occurred that involves some bugs. And I'll get to that in a second. But even before that, they were under this very evil and corrupt regime. It was actually an evil queen. And the nation was a mess, and they had basically turned from God, and their main sin was that they had gotten independent. They just went, we don't need you anymore. Does it sound familiar? And so God had sent the prophet Joel to come and give them a wake-up, a warning of the next thing that was to come. And what you'll find, though, in some of these Old Testament books and the prophets is sometimes, have you guys heard the term doom and gloom? They're doom and gloom prophets. I read this quite funny fictitious interview that somebody wrote, and like they were interviewing Joel. And it was funny. They were like, okay, so you're a real Old Testament prophet. And he was like, yeah. And it almost reminded me of something like on The Tonight Show or something. And they said, so did you get to do the whole doom and gloom thing? And he was like, oh, yeah. And I described all this crazy stuff. And he goes, but I'm a minor prophet. People tend to forget guys like us, you know. And it gets to the end, and the interviewer says, man, that must have been cool, getting to talk about all that. And he said, no, you're totally missing the point. He said, we don't like telling people bad stuff's going to happen, but it's God showing mercy that he's giving people a heads up. He's trying to warn them to say, look, you can avoid this, but here's what you got to do in order to avoid. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's dive in here. We're going to start actually in the second chapter, verse 27. And this is, the first word here is then. And I want you to circle that word then. And the reason I want you to circle that word is the time that this happened is very, very important. It happened between disasters, okay? So they have just had this natural disaster, and God is very specific on time about what can happen when, okay? So circle then. It says, then you will know that I am in Israel, that I am the Lord your God, and that there is no other. Never again will my people be shamed. This is kind of where we're going to land toward the end of the book. This is why the prophet Joel came. This is why God sent him, all right? So number one under that, it's God wrote this, or sent Joel, because he wanted to demonstrate that he is the Lord. That he is the Lord. He wanted everybody to get that concept. Then verse 28 says, and afterward, circle afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. That's one of the most quoted verses out of any of the prophet books. We see that in the book of Acts that Luke wrote. And the point there is God wanted to saturate his spirit upon all people. Upon all people. And one thing that it's good to know in there is that when it says all people, it's actually not talking about every living human. It's talking about people who put their trust in him. Just those people. So to continue setting the scene here, who was Joel? He was, and I kind of thought this was funny, it's quite simple. He was a prophet who didn't speak of himself. It's common in the prophet books for people to kind of give a lineage, where they came from. He didn't do that. It says in verse 1 that his dad, I think his name's Pethuel, I think that's how you say it, and you go like, oh, cool, so we have an idea of who he is. Nobody knows who that is. So it's kind of like, hi, I'm Joel, son of old what's-his-name. That's all we've got to go on in terms of Joel. And that was a big deal because it really shows you that God can take anybody and speak to nations, right? You don't have to have a big lineage, which for a guy like me is awesome. Secondly, when did this happen? The theological answer, if you dive into it, is we do not know. We don't know exactly when this happened. There's some guesses, but nobody really knows. But it did come at a time when kings didn't matter. This wasn't, you guys know in some of the other books it talks a lot about the kings of the day, right? This wasn't one of those. A little side note that I found interesting, I told you this earlier, but there was an evil queen who reigned for, they guess, about 6 years. Althea was her name. And she was overthrown, but she was very, very evil, and she was tied to all kinds of evil kings. And she actually killed all of the heirs of her kids, except one, because they hid him in the temple. His name was Josiah, and he was 1 year old when that happened. And at this time, they actually appointed him king, and he was 7 years old. So can you imagine kind of going, we've just had a massive natural disaster, and the king's 7. Like, what saith the king? He wants a happy meal? And then what? This was after a season of intense sorrow, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. After a season of intense sorrow. And then the question is this: why so much grief? What was the big deal? And number one is that the loss that we're talking about with this kind of plague that hit them, this natural disaster, was historic. It had never been seen before. If you look in verse 2, it says, have we ever seen anything like this? They'd never seen anything like this. And in that interview I told you about, the kind of fictitious interview, the interviewer is asking Joel, so what did God send? What did he send to him? And he said, well, actually, it was locusts. And he said, are we talking like the book of Revelation locusts with heads the size of a lion and tails like a scorpion? And he goes, no, they were just the normal ones, like a couple inches long that eat vegetation. And he went, seriously, that's what God used to cause this? But check this out. Verse 3, tell your children and let your children tell it to their children and their children to the next generation. What he was trying to say here was, don't let this story die. Let it never be forgotten. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. And you got to understand something about the locust. And we have a picture of the locust, I think. Look at this guy. These things are nuts. So they basically devour everything in their path when they get into swarm mode. You know this is happening right now in Madagascar? This is current news. Since 2012, this has been happening over there, and they've declared it a 3-year state of emergency. They estimate it's going to cost $41 million to deal with. This is today with modern technology. But these locusts get into swarm mode, and they can reproduce so fast that they estimate within 1 square yard, they can lay about 65 to 75,000 eggs. And within about 4 weeks, they can do it again. And these things, even when they can just crawl, they can travel 400 to 600 feet per day, and they basically just eat everything in their paths. So that's what this was. It was pretty gnarly. And also the locust, if you remember, was one of the plagues that hit Egypt. So think if you're the nation of Judah, if you're the Israelites, these bugs helped save you at one point. And now they're coming to attack you. And it was very symbolic that God was saying, you guys have become just as bad as the Egyptians. And he had to do something about it. One other thing that is under the lid here is there was a drought. So the bugs come, they eat everything. Just imagine our area. Imagine Roseville, imagine Granite Bay, Loomis, Rockland, and you walk out and everything is gone. Everything, your cars, the roads, in and out. Whole Foods, no more Whole Foods, Safeway, it's all gone. And there's no way to get it back. It's a very hopeless situation. That's why this grief was so intense. Number two, it was unexpected loss. Nobody saw this coming. Unexpected loss. You guys remember how you felt when 9/11 happened? It was kind of that level. It was probably even greater than that, honestly. It was just devastating for them. Verse 8 says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. So basically, this gal is going to get married, and her fiance dies. It's that level of grieving. Super intense. So the question down below that, why does this matter today? How does this apply to us? And here's the reality, is that all of us are going to experience loss, either have experienced it, will experience it, or we know somebody who's experienced it. How many in here would fall into one of those three categories? So pretty much everybody. So one of the keys here is how do they respond to this disaster? And really that's as God is looking to restore, which is what this is about, he's trying to encourage them to respond in a good way. That's really why Joel was sent. And you know, where you choose to stand in all of this is such a huge deal. There's a great story that Kurt told. This happened back in March 2011. There was a Japanese lady named Ahumi Osuga, and she was in her home doing origami with her kids, and an earthquake hit. And they felt the tremor and kept going about their business, and suddenly her husband shouted out, "Get out of there." And she grabbed the kids and ran out into the front yard, and you know what they saw? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everything looked fine. And her husband said, "Everybody in the car." And they got in the car, and they drove up this hill 12 miles to this place that he had kind of thought, you know what, if this ever happens, that's where we're going. And it was kind of a family home up on the top of this hill. And within a short amount of time, a 30-foot wall of water came and wiped their entire city out. But they were saved because they heeded the warning. Okay? They were saved because they heeded the warning. So how we choose to respond to warnings in bad situations is huge. So let's keep moving on here. Point number one is no matter how worried we get when we have bad things happen, we need to face the truth. No matter how worried we get, we need to face the truth. Now, I don't know if you know this about people in general. We don't really like the truth. It's tough, right? What's that old saying about the truth? The truth hurts. The truth hurts. So we tend to just go, let's just not do truth. As a matter of fact, car companies have figured this out. They know that the truth hurts, and so they try to massage that pain a little bit with the gas gauge. So we have a gas gauge. Did you know that when your gas gauge is on full, your car is always full? How many know that? Not so. They actually set your gas gauge up to show that it's on full longer than it's actually on full, because we don't feel as good when we see the gas gauge not on full. How crazy is that? And now I'm on the next one. On the other side of the spectrum, I'm going to settle a bunch of marriage arguments here. When the car is on empty, are you actually on empty? No, there's still a couple gallons more gas in the tank, ladies. I'm not going there. No, sorry. I went there. I did. My bad. Okay. And my wife's here. I was so not. That was not for you, though. You're perfect at that. But you still have a couple gallons more gas when you're on E. And the reason they do that, honestly, is how many of you in this room that if when you got to E and you were actually out of gas, you would just be stuck in the middle of the road, traffic jam, full on. That's why they do that. All right? But even with a gas gauge, we don't like pure truth. So the gas light, what do they call it? You can see a little theme here. It's a warning light. We could rename this book, the Book of Joel, Warning Light. So read here in verse 13, put on sackcloth, you priests, and mourn. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come, spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before my God. This was sincere leaders that he was speaking to first. For the grain offerings and drink offerings are withheld from the house of your God. What he wanted him to do was come in, and at that time, the house of the Lord was where they actually stored the extra, kind of the emergency supplies. And he wanted him to come in and see that it was gone, that there was nothing left. It was really a sober accounting. Declare a holy fast. And really the point of that fast, or some translations kind of call it a day of restraint. Basically being free of distraction. He wanted them to come in and really get this and really focus on it and really feel it. Call a sacred assembly, summon the elders and all who live in the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. What he meant by that is pray. So it was not enough in this situation to just mourn or lament. It was not going to cut it. He was saying you have to come in and mourn and pray. Mourn and pray. So under the app question here, and this is, if you walked away with nothing else from today but this, that'd be okay by me. When we get hit by tragedy, and understand that because of what happened before Joel showed up, because this nation was run in a very evil way, there was a lot, people were victimized, kids were bought and sold. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. And you know what? It wasn't everybody's fault. And this plague, this swarm of locusts hit everybody differently. And in our lives, when we hit massive catastrophe, when something strikes, a lot of times we spend our time asking, why, God, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And when they saw something great happen was when they switched from that to, what are you trying to say? God, what are you trying to say? It's not easy to do. But what is he saying right now? I would ask you that today. What's God saying to you right now through your hardships? Number two, no matter how worked up or overwhelmed we get, we need to seek humility. We need to seek humility. And for those of you who may be new to church, that's not the kind of humility that we're talking about, where you kind of walk in and you hold your head down and you kind of, that's not what this is talking about. It's talking about legitimate, heartfelt humility. How many in here can get overwhelmed or startled a little easily? Well, it's really true about the human condition. Any of us can get kind of flipped out pretty easily. I was on a flight once from Dallas, Texas. I was flying back home. I was by myself. Usually I travel with other people. I was flying home, and we took off, and it was nighttime. And I always sit in a specific seat in this certain airplane, and I'm kind of an airplane buff. And I know all the sounds, and I kind of know when they're supposed to happen. You see where this is going? And we get up over the city, and I noticed that we leveled off early, which was not, it's never comforting. If you've ever flown out of Orange County, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. The throttle back, and he's like, ah! So all of a sudden, I hear the flaps start to go up, and then I hear the landing gear start to come up. And rather than coming up and then the hydraulics doing their thing where it sounds like Free Willy, I hear this, and I'm right on top of it. And it was like, and then the plane throttles back, and then I hear it again. And it's something very wrong. And then the plane starts to go like this, and then like that, and then nose up, nose down. This is not good. So I looked down the aisle of the plane at the flight attendant who's sitting at the back of the plane, right in the middle. And I went. This is true. And she looked back at me, as a flight attendant should, because they always stay calm, cool, and collected, and said, I promise she'd... And I really thought I was on a plane that was going down. I really did. It was quite scary. I mean, that fear felt like it permeated into my bone marrow, and I think after that experience, my blood type had changed. But rather than going, why, God, why didn't you warn me? I shouldn't be on this plane. I can't believe this is happening. I just went, God, thank you. You've blessed me with a great life. And I don't want to die right now, but if this is my time, this is my time. And just pray you take care of my wife and my kids. And God, if there's anything I need to get right with you on, I just want to lift that to you now. And man, I really started going down that road. But it was sort of like going, I want to have a humble attitude when I get overwhelmed and when I get worked up. So it's so important to seek humility. Read in verse 2:12, and this is, I always think of these ideas and then I don't do them. I was going to wear a white t-shirt today and Sharpie on 2:12 onto my chest, just because I like this verse so much. So all of this craziness and calamity has happened, and God says this, even now, declares the Lord. There's one, in the Message, it says, it's not too late. It's not too late. Return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. I don't know if you know this, but when they mourned back then, they would tear their clothes. That's how people would know they were mourning, right? And God's going, I don't want that kind of thing. It's not an outward deal. It's not a religious kind of thing. I want the real deal. I want you to do that in your heart. I want the real you. I want the real you. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate. Blow the trumpet in Zion, declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, consecrate the assembly, bring together the elders, gather the kids, gather the nursing. This one's crazy. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. What's the number one occasion you would never interrupt people on? Their honeymoon. Can you imagine just going, you guys need to come back now? This was a big deal. That's what they're trying to say. It was poetically written of going, this is huge. It was all people at all times, in every circumstance. So the application question here, what part of your heart is not fully exposed to God? What part of your heart is not fully exposed to God? And number 3 is no matter how weary you get, Look for God's provision. Look for God's provision. I am sending you grain, new wine, and olive oil, enough to satisfy you fully. Never again will I make you an object of scorn to the nations. I will drive the northern horde far from you. This is like an immediate deal because of their response to this tough situation. Pushing it into a parched and barren land, its eastern ranks will drown in the Dead Sea, and its western ranks in the Mediterranean Sea, and its stench will go up, its smell will rise. Surely he has done great things. You know, when we face those trials, and some of you know about this recent thing that we've walked through in our family. I know some of you are going through things like this right now. When we found out, when I started making this new album, that Laura had this rare this appendiceal cancer. It's a very rare kind of deal. And we were that was kind of just a blow to us that came out of nowhere. It was unexpected. It was, in our case, it was historic. It was unlike anything we had ever experienced. And I'd felt utterly overwhelmed. And I had committed to finish this album. And when you do that, there's all kinds of things that fall into place and things that get printed up. And there's a lot of things that if I don't do that, it gets a lot of people in a lot of trouble. So I felt a lot of pressure. And I had to look for God's provision just with that. To go, I don't even have enough songs, and I don't have the emotional bandwidth to even write any songs. And if I'm honest, I'm kind of mad. And can I tell you a crazy thing that happened? By the time we were done, we didn't get to record all the songs that we wrote. They just showed up. Do you guys remember Easter at the mall? When we did that song, Live to Praise You? That song was written in about an hour, about a week before Easter. And all this was going on at that time. And then, just like he was kind of showing off, I get a CD in the mailbox at my house that's addressed to my home address, which I don't know how this person got my home address, because they're from the East Coast. And it was some random person I don't know. And they sent me a song. And we're taking our kids to an event at the school this evening, and how do I say this? I get handed a lot of songs and CDs, and usually when I listen to them, yeah, sometimes it's, it's not stuff that you maybe want to put on repeat. And so it was more curiosity. I just wanted to hear this one. And we had heard some that were just downright funny, and some of them were actual comedy that you get. So I like listening and seeing what little gems you can find. And I put this CD in, and I start driving, and it comes on, and I'm like, And I start listening, and the song is beautiful. It's just beautiful. And it's a song that I intend to record at some point. We just ran out of time. And I'm like tearing up on the way over to this deal, and I feel like God's going, hey, look, I can send you songs in the mail if you need songs. Look to me for provision when you're in the middle of your trial. So here's the question there. Where are you looking? Where are you looking for your provision? And something I want you to look at real quick, and I am soundly out of time, but verse 25, it says, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. I will repay you. And my wife showed me this. I thought it was really cool. It said this. It said, God must deal with sin. He had to deal with the state that the nation was in. But it said, when we repent, we find abundant blessings that more than compensate for what was lost. His grace abounds. More than compensates for what was lost. I don't know what that looks like for you today. in the trials that you're facing or that you will face, or somebody that you love and know is facing or will face. I don't know what that looks like. But I do know this, that a life lived trusting in God and looking to Him, a life lived where we seek humility, a life lived where we face the truth and we trust Him is better than any other life we could have. Amen. So final thought, what stands between disaster and judgment? Because that was really what was going on. There was a disaster that had happened, and then there was a judgment that was coming. And Joel shows up and goes, hey man, it's not too late. He's the dad who said, get out of there, go up to the top of the hill. Right? He shows up, and God sent him not to be a doom and gloom guy, but God sent him because He cares about us and He loves us and He's merciful. And He's saying, you got a way out of this. You don't have to be part of this judgment. It's coming, but you can avoid it. The building's coming down, but you can go get outside. And the answer to that is the person of Jesus. That's who stands in that gap. The person of Jesus. And it was so odd to me that this verse actually shows up. It's Joel 3:16. I want you to read that. You guys are familiar with John 3:16, yeah? For Christ so loved the world that He came, He gave His only begotten Son, right? Or for God so loved the world. Joel 3:16. Do we have it up here? Oh, perfect. I have a different translation down here. Sometimes I like to read these in different translations. Something you should check out sometime. It's very fascinating. The Lord will roar from Zion and thunder from Jerusalem. The earth and the heavens will tremble, but the Lord will be a what? A refuge for His people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. Blessings for God's people. Isn't that cool that this book starts with bugs eating everything in sight and causing massive devastation, and it ends this way? And if you just continue on, and I want to encourage you to do that when you go home, God says, look, what was done to you will not go unavenged. I've got your back. Well, if we can bow our heads and close our eyes today. Just want to encourage some of you in here who may not have a relationship with God. That today you can do that. Today you can have that. I firmly believe with all my heart that a life lived without Christ, without a relationship with Him, can never be the best life you can live. And certainly will never end the way you want it to end. But that your best choice is a life lived with Him, and furthermore, an eternity spent with Him. So if you're here today and that's you, I'm going to pray a very simple prayer, and I want you to pray silently as I pray out loud. If you'd say, you know what, I want to make a change in my life. I want to know the God that we've been talking about. I want to know the God that sent Joel as a warning. I want to know the God who's merciful like that and who would love me unconditionally. So if that's you here today, pray with me silently as I pray out loud. Lord, thank you for bringing me here today. Thank you that you sent your Son to die on a cross. I believe that my sins were forgiven with that. And I receive that now. And Lord, I believe that Jesus rose again so that I could have new life. I receive that new life today. Come into my heart, be the Lord of my life. Make all things new. Make me into a new creation.